Google is telling you to worry about only creating helpful content. Then the prompt says there's actually a hidden scoring system that decides whether your content gets used or ignored. Your content isn't being evaluated by a human. It's being evaluated by a stack of claims against 3 competing sources of truth. Once you start to unpack what's happening under the hood, you realize how complicated and how complex AI SEO can be. So only a few days ago, Google released their How to Optimize for AI Search. The article came out and everybody in the SEO industry basically lost their minds. Only a few days later, somebody was able to reverse engineer all of the system prompts for Gemini, Claude, and it showed that Google, once again, is telling us to do one thing when their systems do the complete opposite. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the individual pieces that were pulled apart by somebody who was able to reverse engineer and leak the system prompts, what they're actually doing and what we need to do to make sure that we appear in AI search in the way that we should appear. So the article was pulled together by a good friend of mine, a guy named Charles Float. The link is in the description below. Please go and read the full article. It is an incredibly detailed piece of work. And what I want to kind of highlight here is that by the end of the article, like Charles says, we want to show 3 misleading pieces of information that Google gave us versus what the actual systems are doing. And so this didn't really happen over the course of a week. Charles has been doing this for the course of a couple of years now. So I'm going to take this information as data backed. He has done the work for sure. And if you just look at this section here, I've been analyzing Opus 4.7 and GPT 5.5. So they are the latest models. And he said that he knew the engineers, what they'd been saying publicly, wasn't exactly marrying up with what he was seeing underneath the hood, which doesn't surprise me at all because there is a PR team for everybody, right? They want to tell you one thing, so you go and help them clean up the web and make sure they don't run into any legal issues. And then separately, they're operating in a completely different manner. So this is what Google said. And I did a video on this a couple of days ago, and the link is in the description as well. So here's what Google said and why it still matters. So Google's guide still points out there are 4 core things to focus on and 3 myths. So the core things are, you don't need to break your content down into tiny pieces for AI. You don't need to create new machine readable files. So that's like Markdown or LLMs.txt. You don't need to seek inauthentic mentions across the web. And AEO and GEO from Google's perspective is still just SEO. So there are 4 core points from that guide. And if you watch the video, you'll see me unpack them with my own perspective. But the thing I want to highlight is the last one is the headline. Google has been telling the entire AI SEO industry for the last 18 months that what we've been doing, the discipline that we've been trying to learn, basically doesn't exist. They tell us to just keep making good content and everything will turn out just fine. But after 12 years in this industry, I know that is not always true. And this comes from the company, as Charles has highlighted here, that AI overviews and AI mode now appear above 60% of informational queries in the US. And the only way they're able to collect those overviews is from the content that you produce. So as an agent in your market, trying to win more listings, Google is just giving you advice so that you can help feed and improve their algorithms. So this is Charles explaining now how he got the prompts and how he analyzed them. So there are 2 ways to do this. One is researcher's disclosure, where some of the models will actually release how they do things. And then the second, which I wouldn't recommend, is prompt injection. So that means you're able to give these models a kind of series of instructions to reveal what is actually going on under the hood. It's very kind of cybersecurity, high risk. I definitely don't recommend that you do it. But by doing this, we're able to identify across 3 different models here in the last 30 days, Claude, GPT 5.5, and Gemini 3 against Google's latest brand new AI SEO guide. So this is where it starts to get interesting. So the hidden judge, this is basically the difference between being shown in AI search and not. So there are 3 types of systems here, which I won't get into, but basically latent knowledge is the pre-trained data that AI models have on you. So the last time you were at a brokerage, your last phone number, the last market that you worked in, just consider that latent knowledge. It's what the AI models currently understand about you. Active retrieval That's what the model will go and fetch in a real life scenario from web search. And then we've got arbitration. So that is the system that decides between the two. That is basically saying, I'm not sure whether I should use old data or whether or not I should go and grab a fresh run. The system has to choose, whether it's GPT or Claude, it has to choose between training data and when to go and retrieve based on the contradictions between the two pieces of information. And here, which I find incredibly interesting, is Claude's own system saying, do not trust its own memory. So for any factual questions about the present day world, Claude must search before answering. It's saying here that even if it feels confident about the answer based on its own training data, it can't skip that arbitration. And like Charles has pointed out here, this is a hard arbitration rule. So even if Claude has the best information in the world about you, it's going to make a decision to override that if it's based on present day searches. Then we've got another one here. When web search results report conflicting factual information or report appear to be incomplete, Claude likes to run more searches to get a clear answer. So even in this section here, it's saying that if it doesn't understand or it doesn't trust the information based on the sources it collected the data from, it needs to go and run another web search. That is another another filter that we have to get through with your content to make sure that you are picked up in AI search. So it seems really easy at face value, but once you start to unpack what's happening under the hood, you realize how complicated and how complex AI SEO can be. Now, this is where Anthropic starts to actually target SEO techniques. We've got like affiliate roundup sites, aggregator listicles, which is a big one because real estate is based heavily on, top 10 real estate agents in Jacksonville, low quality forums. They're all explicitly devalued. That does not translate into GPT. It does not translate into Gemini. However, in Claude specifically, it is devalued. The only sources it prefers to choose are original publishers, primary sources, governmental and peer-reviewed content are explicitly preferred. So for example, if you were featured in the Better Business Bureau, that is obviously peer reviewed. If you are an original publisher of data or, sources of information, which is why Redfin, the MLS, they get referenced quite a lot because they have original data to go after. GPT 5.5 system does the exact same thing, where it says the strongest single arbitration line in any of these leaked prompts, also from GPT 5.5. Treat the current status of information as unknown. So never rely on your memory as the source of truth, even if it conflicts with what you remember. So that's saying, even though you've been trained on all of these billions of documents, you're still going to go and choose a fresh index from Google or Bing. And this is the entire reason. So Charles has highlighted it here. The single instruction is the entire reason the most dominant current result in retrieval wins in AI synthesis. So that means even if you have the best history, the best knowledge, the strongest brand over the course of 20 years, it really doesn't matter, because unless you are in the right places at the right time, on the right course of transaction to marry up with what somebody is searching for, it all goes out of the window. Then we look at Gemini, which is basically saying that Google's own engineers wrote a protocol that lets the model override conflicting data without telling the user that it happened. So again, Google is doing stuff underneath the hood that they're not actually presenting to you, which is a problem. Google continues to lie. Google continues to give you advice, which I don't actually think is advice. I think it's just a deterrent and it's smoke and mirrors. Google's guide, which again, there's a link in the description. You can read it yourself. Says focus on creating helpful content and people first content. Then the prompt says there's actually a hidden scoring system that decides whether your content gets used or ignored. So the helpful content, brilliant. You're just making Google's life much, much easier. You're making the web a better place, which is basically what Google wanted you to do for its entire existence. But it's not telling you underneath the system, there is a judge that decides whether or not your content is used. And it is not just reliant on how good or how high quality that piece of content is. And the important thing to note is that your content isn't being evaluated by a human. It's being evaluated by a stack of claims against 3 competing sources of truth, an arbitration system that you have no documentation for. So this is like black box. This is, you don't know what you need to do, but thanks to Charles basically going through and unpacking all of this, you're able to understand what's happening. And I had to highlight this because this is so good. So if you've been in SEO long enough, this all tracks back to Google's long-standing tradition of trying to force consensus down the algorithm's throat. Then we move on to chunking content. And if you don't know what chunking content means, it just basically means creating short pieces of text so that it's easy to digest and easy to scan by AI search models. What we highlight here is that if your content can't be cleanly extracted at the section level because your headlines are vague, so your H2s, your H3s, your H1s, if they aren't keyword specific, if they are not answering a question that somebody might ask, they are considered vague. A good heading would be, what's it like living in Jacksonville, Florida? A vague heading would be Jacksonville, Florida. So there's no context behind it. Your paragraphs depend on prose that came 3 sections earlier. So that means if I was to set up the premise of an answer, 15 sentences ago, and then I finally get to the answer, it doesn't matter because they're not connected. When you answer something in content, it needs to be, yes, this is the answer because. No, this is the answer because. You don't need to preface the answer before you give it. And then all of that kind of bundles up and says that even if you were to be selected for retrieval, it won't be featured because you're not structured in the right way. So even before you're considered, if your content is not in the right segments, if it is not in the right systematic approach, you're going to be ignored. So one of these is public narrative and the other is the reality. Then we move on to the mention trap, which is getting mentions across the web, different citations, different press releases, local directories, that kind of thing. In Google's guide, it says seeking inauthentic mentions across the web isn't as helpful as it might seem. What they actually mean is it's not helpful to them because Google then has to worry about what's real and what's not real. But does that mean it's not a viable tactic to get mentioned in AI search? Of course it doesn't, but Google wants to keep you well away from it. In the guide, it doesn't matter whether your entity gets mentioned because I can get mentioned on all of my local press outlets and they could all be super low quality. What matters is the sources that mention you. So we think about an authority piece. We think about national press. We think about real estate specific publications that are trusted and they are quote unquote seed sites. When we think about a company blog, it beats an aggregator listicle. That means if you were to get a blog feature on moving storage or moving companies in Jacksonville, Florida, and you are a real estate agent in that same area, if they were to write and include a section about you and link to you, it's stronger than if it was a peer review, real estate specific, based on transaction type of website. Now, that doesn't mean that aggregators themselves and listicles themselves are devalued because it works incredibly well. But when it tries to balance between the two, it's always going to choose the one that is harder to get. And then it talks about, getting on a government paper. That's not going to happen for you. So we're going to ignore those. Then the logic from GPT 5.5, to produce a credible response, you must rely on high quality domains. This is something that we speak about at Flydragon and have spoken about for the better part of nearly a year and a half. Ensure more than half of citations come from widely recognized outlets on the topic. Again, Fast Expert, Rate My Agent, different review publications, different press outlets. We need to make sure that it's diversified. Something, again, we've been talking about for a long time. When using search to answer technical questions, you must rely on primary sources, research papers, official documentation, etc., etc. So think about housing markets, think about mortgage rates. They're not going to come from you directly because you don't have the weight to be able to answer those questions in comparison with a government website or an actual registered practicing mortgage broker, for example. So in OpenAI's own words, it says, ignore information from less reputable domains, rely on high quality domains, and only rely on primary sources. So what Google's guide is not saying, but is still true, is that building authentic mentions across multiple independent high quality sources is one of the only things the model can use to validate that your entity is real. So Google told you to do one thing, the truth of the situation is entirely different. So what we're seeing here is a real picture forming. Google is telling you to worry about only creating helpful content, but it doesn't say that structuring your content in a certain way is going to be the only thing that helps you pass by the retrieval. Google says a bunch of things in these articles that are considered a myth. For example, it doesn't tell you about the arbitration rule between live web search and the knowledge that it has on you. It doesn't talk about the fact that inauthentic mentions doesn't actually mean that. It means if you get tons of mentions on reputable sites, you're going to be able to pass these quality or source quality filters much, much easier. The rules of any search engine is to make the web easier and to make the experience for users, your homeowners, a much better overall kind of hands-on experience. The problem is when you have two conflicting and competing ideologies, one we are a publicly traded company. We have to keep shareholders happy. We have to avoid any legal disputes and issues versus we have to then keep users happy. It creates this really horrible paradox where nobody can tell the truth. The industry, including me, for the last 20 years has been dealing with this. I've been doing this for 12 years. I've always been very cautious of what Google says versus what I need to do. If Google says one thing in a document, the chances are I'm going to do the opposite. If Google says don't go and get links, I'm going to go and get links. If Google says don't worry about mentions on the web, I'm going to go and get mentions on the web, because retrieval layer SEO, which is the big takeaway here, is the only thing you need to worry about. The gap is the moat between what you can do from distribution, so mentions and content, and what Google is telling you to do. It's not AEO, it's not GEO, and it's not just good SEO. It is AI SEO, which is incredibly nuanced, incredibly difficult to do, and something that the industry hasn't really dove deep on from what I can tell. There's a lot of flippant advice, there's a lot of untested, unstructured recommendations for agents out there, and this might be too technical for a lot of people, I get that, but this is me showing you the difference between somebody who is paying attention to what is actually happening versus somebody who is just listening to the hype of the echo chamber. I really hope you found this interesting. Like I said, there is details of the article in the description below. There is also a link to go and watch Charles's webinar on the 22nd of May. And so I highly recommend you check it out. I'm in no way affiliated with Charles. I just think the research is brilliant. And let's make sure that we don't get stuck in the loop of trying to listen to what Google says. And because of that, you miss out on tons of opportunity.